Bueno, pues bienvenidos a todos. Me da tanto gusto verlos aquí en comunidad hoy día, después del día de Martin Luther King. Creo que es el National Day of Racial Healing. Así que me puse a pensar esta mañana, wow, qué día más, no sé, mejor para estar en comunidad hoy día. Hoy tenemos a Shannon Quinn. Ella va a ser nuestra presentadora hoy día, nuestro speaker, y ella va a presentar sobre trabajando con crisis en Latina communities, en las comunidades latinas. Eh, Shannon trabaja en Washburn Center for Children como terapeuta de estabilización de crisis y en raíces sagradas, salud mental comunitaria, como terapeuta de largo plazo. Su trabajo en Washburn se enfoca principalmente en trastornos de salud mental en jóvenes de 11 a 17 años, con un enfoque especial en desarrollar y mantener la seguridad para los jóvenes en riesgo de causar daño a sí mismos o a otras personas. En su vida profesional, a Shannon le interesan los temas de salud mental comunitaria, los efectos de trauma intergeneracional y la educación psicológica al nivel comunitario. Entonces, Shannon, eh, tienes co-host, así que no sé si quieras presentar algo, lo puedes hacer, pero si necesitas alguna ayuda, me dejas saber. Yo voy a tener mis ojos en el chat, así si surgen preguntas, yo te las puedo pasar.
Perfecto, ok. Am, bueno, estaría bien si nos presentamos rapidito antes de empezar, solo porque creo que solamente conozco a Carolina y no creo que a nadie más. Pues sí, tú.
Sí. ¿Quién quisiera empezar primero?
Bueno, yo puedo. Mi nombre es Alicia Bauer. Soy una trabajadora social aquí en el colegio de South, en South High School. También trabajo en Children's Hospital como trabajadora social ahí en el salón de emergencia. He estado con el consorcio muchos años, pero no he estado por mucho tiempo. Entonces, bienvenida, un gusto verla.
Pues yo igual.
Ajá, bien, está bien, gusto verte.
Mi nombre es Mercedes Moreno y soy una intercesora de violencia doméstica y violencia sexual con la clínica Cook, Community University Healthcare Center. Gracias, Shannon.
Hola, buenos días. Me llamo Yareli. Yo soy trabajadora social ahorita con Catholic Charities. Estoy trabajando como Care Coordinator para su departamento de Aging y Disability Services. Ha trabajado en el pasado como trabajadora social de escuela, escolar, pues, y tuve la oportunidad de trabajar con estudiantes de la edad de kinder a tercer grado. Sí, gracias.
Bienvenida, Cassidy. Estamos haciendo introducciones. So if you'd like to introduce yourself, you can if you'd like. We're just kind of popcorning around. Yo soy Nancy. Nancy Ortega. Yo trabajo en Washburn Center for Children. Yo soy terapeuta de casa, Intensive in-Home. Yo trabajo con la familia y con el menor de edad. Así que veo a las familias 2 veces a la semana en casa. Yeah. Y también soy board member del consorcio, así que por eso me van a ver facilitating. Yo hablo Spanglish, así que facilitating la reunión de hoy. ¿Alguien más quisiera presentarse hoy día?
Hi there, I'm Cassidy. I work at Indian Health Board. And we work a lot with Spanish folks, but we don't really do a lot of training about working with the Latino community. And I understand a lot of Spanish. I don't speak it very well. But yeah, I'm excited to learn more because it's like a big portion of our population.
Bueno, awesome. It seems like, tal vez, ¿cómo te parece, Nancy? It seems like we can get started. Oh,
Sí.
ahí está Mari.
Parece.
Bueno. So Mari Torres está aquí del Condado de Dakota, Public Health. Amazing. Thank you, Mari.
Good morning. Buenos días. Mi
Buenos
nombre es Camden. Soy trabajadora social supervisando servicios Immigration Affairs Office en el condado de Dane, Madison, Wisconsin. Y aquí sí estamos como 13 bajo cero ahorita más o menos.
Yeah.
La primera vez que estoy atendiendo al Consorcio y bueno, interesada en saber y aprender de ustedes.
Bienvenida. -13, wow.
No.
Aquí.
Nancy, if I haven't introduced myself, my name is Carolina Melguizo. I work for CLUS, the manager mental health case manager, and I'm so happy to see here Shannon. We work together at Watchboard and we continue working here and
Todavía trabajamos juntas en
seguimos,
algunos casos.
It's like a community partners for us and we really enjoy that. Thank you for coming.
Yeah, I'm so glad to be here. Okay.
Bienvenida, Whitney, también. Estamos haciendo introducciones. No sé si quieres hacer una introducción.
Yes, good morning. Sorry for joining late. My name is Whitney Núñez. I work at CLUS as well, and I work in the CTSS skills training program.
Okay. Bueno, entonces te la pasamos a ti, Shannon.
Ok, está bien. Bueno, y como dije al comienzo, y podemos intercambiar, voy a hacer esta presentación mayormente en inglés, solamente porque creo que la mayoría del lenguaje que al final usé fue el lenguaje más clínico, y creo que para mí, como inglés es mi primer idioma, fue un poco más fácil hablar en inglés y hablar de esos temas clínicos. Y sin embargo, creo que tengo algunos recursos allá que están en español, entonces podemos ir intercambiando uno al otro. Depende en cómo va la conversación. Y creo que porque igual somos un grupo chiquito, podemos tener una sesión un poquito más conversacional, y si me está tardando algo y quieren brincar a la próxima cosa, también podemos hacer eso. So it can really be more of a conversation, a charla, than a presentation. But I'll throw up the slides just because I like having a visual cuando yo hago algo así. So, primero, ¿dónde está? Ahí. Ok. ¿Cómo se ve eso? Un thumbs up or thumbs down de cualquier persona que pueda ver. Good. Okay, and then I need to be able to see mis notas. Perfecto. Okay, and I need to see them in a way that doesn't block the whole screen. Okay. Nadie puede ver mis notas, ¿cierto? Good. All right. Voy a verme muy presionada entonces. Wonderful. So, hola a todos. Hello, everyone. I'm so glad you're here. I'm excited to talk about this. I think crisis stabilization is something that is really relevant to the Spanish-speaking community. I wanted to give a little background on myself first, where I'm coming from, my current role, the lens that I'm viewing this situation with. And I think for most of you, anyone working in the Spanish-speaking community, in community health and mental health, all of this is going to sound very familiar. And I think we're going to see some of the same issues popping up. And so anytime you have anything to share, please message or jump in. like I said, I really like these kinds of presentations to be more of a conversation about what we're seeing and what we think could be beneficial. So just to kind of start with, like Nancy said, I'm a crisis stabilization therapist at the Washburn Center for Children. I've been there about 2.5 years, going on 3 years now, since spring of 21. And the Washburn Center, for those of you who haven't worked with our agency or who haven't connected with us, we're a mental health agency based out of Minneapolis, and the agency serves a variety of mental health needs for kids 3 to 17. We have outpatient therapy, we have case management, we have intensive in-home, Nancy's program. We have a whole variety of services. The only thing we don't do is intensive outpatient groups, and we don't do hospitalization level services. My program itself is short-term. It's technically 3 months, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. It's short-term stabilization focus, like the name says, intensive outpatient therapy. So minimum twice a week for kids 5 to 17 experiencing mental health decline. So we're looking for kids who are struggling in more than one area. So they're really struggling at school, at home, with peers. I would say most of the kids I get are really struggling in all of those areas. I think, like I mentioned, one of the hardest parts about my job in the crisis stabilization program is the duration. It's very short. And compared to my colleagues who speak English or are working with English-speaking families, I usually end up spending double or more the amount of time with Spanish-speaking families for a whole lot of reasons. I do try to highlight for families and clients in the beginning that this is short-term, just because it is already so hard to transition. I try to make sure that we are keeping that in mind the whole time, and that we're focusing together on assessment. So what is happening? Connection with other resources. What do we even want to do with the situation? And then transition. How are we going to get to longer term services? In my experience over the last couple of years, this concept of crisis stabilization already isn't particularly culturally resonant or great with the families I'm working with. I think it runs into a couple different cultural barriers around what expectations of therapy are, what kind of the idea of a therapist is, runs into some things that I didn't talk about later, but I could, about kind of cultural values around privacy and around who should know about this problem going on in the family. And I've found almost always that transitioning to other services for families, opening themselves up to a new provider, in particular, if I can't find another Spanish-speaking provider, is really, really hard. So it's just something that comes up quite a bit. Before we really jump in, I also wanted to give you an idea of where I'm speaking from when I talk about crises. I think all of us probably see different kinds of crises in our different areas of work. For me, my typical client usually is an adolescent, usually cisgender female, though that can change. There's different waves that come in. Usually someone who's very internalizing. They're functioning so-so at home and school, but their internal world is horrible. And they tend to have chronic suicidality, chronic stressors, very few social connections. So that's my typical kid. That's usually who I'm working with. And then in working with those kids, I usually use a mixture of cognitive behavioral therapy and dialectical behavioral therapy. Those are my comfortable therapy homes. And I usually tend to focus on skills, tangible skills, mindfulness, psychoeducation, things that they can take away with them. And then in our crisis stabilization program, we hear over and over and over again, safety, safety, safety. That's our only goal. And so my main goal as the therapist in this program is to help the kids I see learn how to stay safe. So how do we safety plan? What is a safety plan? How do I even know if I'm at risk? How do I access my supports? And I try to help caregivers or parents come along and learn those same things, so that at the very least, they end their time with me knowing more about how to get help if they need help. Other than that, my professional background was in Spanish interpreting in hospitals. So I spent 7 years as a Spanish medical interpreter. I worked in kind of rural Wisconsin for a few years. I worked in Boston for a few years, so very different populations. I worked with Spanish-speaking folks from all over the world. It was wonderful. So all of Latin America, parts of the Caribbean. I really, really loved what I did, and that got me passionate about mental health, and that's why I went back to school. I think one of my favorite things to do, both as a therapist and in my previous life as a community health worker, is connect with people about physical and mental health on the community level. I see that there's a lot of room for growth in that area here in the Twin Cities, especially for the Spanish-speaking community. So long-term, that's my goal and my focus is I would love to do things or get involved in ways that we can create larger support networks for kids who are experiencing mental health crises and giving more of that support to caregivers and parents so that they can feel competent and able to deal with what's going on with their kids. So one of the things, to kind of jump in, one of the things Nancy and Carolina asked me to talk about is themes I'm seeing in the crisis stabilization families. And I think, like I said, these are going to be very familiar to a lot of you. I think when we do our Spanish-speaking consult at Washburn, I feel like all of us just end up saying like same, same, same over and over again, because the things we see are so repeated in many families. So a couple things that I see that are typical in the crisis program, the nature of the crises. So compared to my English-speaking, like my colleagues working with English-speaking families, one thing I see is that the crises that come in with my families are chronic and not acute. So the crises have been going on for a long time, and that there are usually multiple crises that have been going on for a long time. So most of the kids that I work with have been dealing with mental health decline for months or years, and their relationships have deteriorated. The way that they interact in their family has gotten worse. And usually that's not the only crisis or even the most important crisis. Most of the time, there are significant financial stressors. So parents or caregivers are struggling to prioritize a child's mental health when we're really needing to prioritize food, roof over our head, basic survival needs. In addition, almost always I have parents, so usually a mother and father, who have a strained relationship, whose communication is not great, who are struggling themselves in their relationship, and that's impacting the current situation. And then typically there's usually more than one child in the family, and most children in the family system are dealing with mental health needs. And so when parents have limited time, limited resources, limited energy, their attention is going to wherever the kind of the fire is, the most problematic child, the most problematic situation, which causes a lot of other like ruptures and stress in the family. Another typical feature in my caseload is that most of my kids have never seen a therapist prior to starting with me. That's not always true, but it's often true. I'd say maybe 2/3, like 60 to 70% of my kids. And so that is a lot of pressure. I feel a lot of pressure to like find resources in a short amount of time. And it also becomes this barrier because I come in, I try to build a relationship with the family, and then relatively quickly we need to switch. And that can be difficult when you're just opening yourself up to the idea of doing therapy or your child doing therapy. And another small part of that is with the resourcing. I find case management to be a difficult thing to explain to families who are just starting out in the mental health world. And so explaining how and why and what a case manager can do becomes this conversation that can last the entire 3 months. And by the time we're ending, that's when we're getting a case manager involved to help with resourcing. I think other than that, typical things probably other people see as well. Clients and families are navigating this unfamiliar and not friendly mental health system. It's not friendly to English speakers. It's definitely not friendly to anyone who speaks another language or who comes from a different cultural background. So a lot of my work ends up being with caregivers, helping them understand different levels of care, what even is outpatient therapy versus intensive outpatient versus a group versus the hospital. And then depending on their level of buy-in, helping them connect to those levels of care. And then the last thing I wanted to note that I think all of us know, but the most important thing and the thing that affects most of my work is that all families I work with have really extensive intergenerational trauma. Most caregivers I work with have long trauma histories that impact their day-to-day functioning. It impacts how they see themselves as caregivers, their ability to parent, their ability to engage with me in treatment. So I think that's the primary need I see, is that so many parents and caregivers need mental health support in order to do what I'm asking. And there's not really a way for them to access mental health. And so what do we do then? And this was kind of just a continuation. I realized after I wrote it, complicating factors, it's a lot of the same things, but things that make work harder or make crises worse. Most families are dealing with poverty. So I'd say 90 to 95% of my clients have a PMAP. I can think of very few in the last couple of years that have had commercial insurance. And that hasn't necessarily meant that they're doing well financially, just that it was available. The persistent presence of intergenerational trauma. So caregivers almost always have gone through multiple traumatic events. All of them have at least gone through immigration, which is traumatic in and of itself. And then there's almost always a family history of complex intergenerational trauma from parents to grandparents, grandparents to great-grandparents that comes out as we're working together. The education piece is a complicating factor. I would say not as much as some people might think it is, but many of my parents or caregivers finished school sometime between late elementary and early high school. Some have finished high school, some have more education than that. It just means sometimes we're either talking past each other or I'm looking for resources that are the appropriate reading level. That can be difficult. And then the piece that I think I find to be most limiting is compared to many families. So like, it's actually the opposite most of the time, and I'll talk about this in a second. Many families I work with have a ton of social connection, which is a huge strength. The families I find that are in the deepest levels of crisis and who are hardest to work with are the ones who are very isolated. They don't have friends. They don't have any family or extended family here. They don't have padrinos. They don't have compadres. They don't have a church affiliation. They tend to be very alone. And those families tend to struggle a lot more than families I know that have a lot of social connection, a large social network, who are dealing with the same level of mental health issues in their kids. And then the last piece is I also touched on already. Many caregivers have really inflexible schedules. They don't have time off to use. They cannot take a break. And so I'm supposed to meet with parents 1 to 2 times a week, the same as the kids. That can really vary depending on what they're able to do with their work and not get in trouble at work. I did want to touch on strengths. I think this is important in working with families. I like to highlight strengths for them too, because it's a huge factor in how they're going to get better. As much as I said, the longer term crises tend to also be a complicating factor, it can be a strength as well. Because the crises tend to be longer term, the families I work with tend to have found ways to survive these crises for a very long time, usually with very little support. So any support we can find is an improvement on the situation. Most families have navigated on their own. They've found creative solutions to these long-term problems, and somehow they've gotten to the point they are where I'm meeting them. And so that's a huge strength. They have already resourced themselves despite being in a situation where resources are not very available. The other piece, like I mentioned, many of the families I work with are extremely well connected in their community, which is amazing. There is so much word of mouth, person-to-person connection. I'm always impressed by families and caregivers I work with coming to me and sharing a resource with me or sharing information with me that I didn't know about. So it's a huge strength. I love this piece of my work. I love partnering with caregivers in navigating their community and resources. Also the openness. I've been so surprised sometimes by how open caregivers are to allowing me into their home, allowing me into these kind of secret or scary parts of their life. I think I've seen many, many caregivers not necessarily agree with me, not align with me, but be open to working with me. Like, we won't have the same definition of mental health, we won't have the same definition of trauma, but they'll sit down with me and they'll talk with me, and they want their kids to be doing better, and they're willing to talk about different ways that could happen. And it's one of the best parts of what I do. And then I think this is just a pattern I've seen that I would be so curious to know more about if I were a research person, which I'm not. But there's less individual intensity in Spanish-speaking families and clients than my colleagues who work with English-speaking families. And this could be just a pattern over the last 2.5 years, but my clients tend to be less outward acting. I don't have many clients who are actively trying to hurt others, their parents, their siblings, people at school. I don't have a ton of clients trying to run away from home or steal cars, or engage in other very destructive behavior. Most of my colleagues, that's their population. And so there are many days where I'm very grateful to be working with my kids who are at least ready to sit down and do therapy. So I'm not sure if that's something specific to the Spanish-speaking community, but it is something I've noticed over the last couple of years when we're doing consults and comparing cases at our crisis stabilization meetings.
And
I did see a chat. I wanted to make sure.
Yes, somebody
Yes.
agreed. And says, yes,
It's so
very
wonderful.
Mhm.
It is, yeah, it's one of my favorite parts. It's such a privilege to come in with families. Most families end up telling me all sorts of things about their history, their story, why they're here, what happened to them. And it's hard, and it is, like I said, one of the best parts of my job. I love when a caregiver feels connected enough to me to share something with me about who they are and why they're showing up the way they show up. That part is just wonderful. One thing that Carolina and Nancy asked me to talk about is how to identify a crisis. I think this can be so diverse, but I tried to narrow down what I see personally when my kids are approaching a crisis. So I decided to start with what I see most, which is my kids with internalizing behaviors, so my inward-facing kids, how they move from chronic crisis, which is usually where they are, to an acute crisis. And just to kind of clarify, most of my crises are suicidal ideation. I have others, and I'll touch on others, but that's where I'm most familiar and most comfortable. And so for my internalizing clients, I typically see depression or depressive patterns getting worse before a crisis hits. So they'll become more withdrawn. They talk less. If they are talking to friends or family, they're not anymore. In particular, a big red flag I start to see is that they engage with me less in scaling their risk level, which we'll talk about in a second. I usually do this every session with kids, or almost every session. It's part of being in the crisis stabilization program that we risk assess and safety plan at least once, but usually frequently. And so I'm usually checking in a lot with these kids. And as a crisis approaches, I'll notice them start to disengage from those risk assessments and be like, I'm fine. It's fine. I don't know. So that can kind of be a pink flag for me that I need to be keeping an eye on them, even though I can't call them out necessarily and be like, hey, you're about to do something, and I kind of know it. I will say, and Nancy's experienced this too, some of our higher risk clients start to leave clues. I'll have a couple that play songs, show me media, talk about movies or shows that talk about self-harm or death, often at the same time denying any worsening of symptoms. And so those are some of my clues that we're about to go kind of over the edge, that something is reaching a breaking point. For my externalizing clients, which I don't have as many of, but my kids who hit, punch, scream, yell, steal, I tend to just see the opposite, like behaviors start to escalate. They have been making threats toward parents. It starts to move toward action. actions become more directed. They were punching walls, now they're punching the wall above mom's head. Actions increasing in intensity or consequence. For example, like they were a kid who skipped school a ton. Now they're not coming home. Now they're stealing money from a parent. Now they're talking about like stealing from a store. So I tend to see the opposite, where my depressive or internalizing clients tend to kind of withdraw and go downward. My externalizing clients tend to keep getting bigger and start indicating that something is going to tip over the edge. Usually the clients, this is another kind of pattern or something else that is a risk factor. My clients who will go into a true crisis, so differentiating from the chronic crisis, they're at immediate risk of hurting themselves or other people, tend to have very little caregiver involvement in services. For me, that can mean two things. It can mean either the caregiver parent isn't physically involved, they can't really get out of work, they can't really meet with me. It's not necessarily a lack of desire, but a lack of ability. I also see this with parents who are more avoidant. They just don't want to meet with me, or they do, but then when it comes down to meeting, they're not there. And the last thing I see is a lack of emotional engagement. So a parent who's consistently showing up to meetings, consistently talking with me, but they're not emotionally there. They shut down, they're dismissive, they're not really in problem-solving mode. The other thing that pushes us from chronic crisis to an acute crisis, the clients have means, so they have some way to hurt themselves or others. If a client has chronic suicidal ideation and thinks about drowning, but doesn't have any body of water or any access to water in that way, I'm still concerned, but I'm not as concerned. If a client thinks about overdosing and has access to pills, I am much more concerned. We are kind of at the point of immediate crisis when we get to that point. And the last piece of moving from kind of these chronic long-term crises to we are in an emergency is when there's been some sort of change. So most families and clients that I'm seeing have been tolerating for a long time. And then there's a change. Somebody moves, housing becomes unstable, change in schools, a friendship ends, there's a blowout fight with a caregiver. And all of a sudden we're going from we're tolerating this high level of distress to we are exploding. Oh. Let's see if I can keep switching. I can. Okay. I also wanted to check before I dive into this. So these are the assessment tools I use mostly for suicidality, like I talked about, that's my primary crisis. But also I pulled in the rubric that the crisis stabilization therapists use when answering the crisis phone. And I wasn't sure what might be most helpful here. I'm not sure if the people in the group use the Columbia screener a lot, in which case I won't spend a lot of time on it because you might already use it all the time, or if it's helpful to go over. Nancy, I don't know if we could like have people say in the chat what would feel most helpful. I can also dive into both.
Yes, if people have comments in the chat or would like to say it out loud, feel free to do so. I think it could be helpful to go just talk briefly a little bit about both of them.
Sure, yeah. Let me see. I want to be able to share. Do you know, Nancy, can I switch to a different screen while I'm sharing? New share. Oh, I can. Never mind. Okay.
Got it.
Oh, all right. Give me a second, everyone. I'm going to try and let me see if I can. I don't know. Otherwise, I'll just have to talk through it. Okay. Can everyone see that? Excellent. Okay. So I have this in Spanish as well. I'll start with this one in English just because this is the more simplified version that I would use day to day. And at this point, I have this pretty much memorized. I think one of the best things that we can do in dealing with this type of crisis, at least, is be really, really comfortable and familiar with questions around suicide. It's a very taboo topic in almost every community. And so one of the ways I handle this is by being really comfortable myself and doing a lot of preface and soft startup before I get into this with families. So I'll normalize right away. Like, you know, I'm asking you these questions because a lot of people have these thoughts. A lot of people experience this. I talk about the facts. We know that the best way to keep people safe is to ask direct questions about what's going on in their heads. And I just try and keep myself really low and slow, even if I'm starting to feel anxious or feel worried about the client or the family. Usually because of crisis stabilization, the service, we do this like in the first 2 sessions, and I use that time to provide education to parents and caregivers too about the same thing, because it's so taboo, because a lot of parents and caregivers get scared by the thought that their kid could be having suicidal thoughts. I use that time to do the same thing. A lot of people have these thoughts. It's very important for me to know what those thoughts are. And the best way that we can keep your kids safe is to ask directly and to know what they're thinking. So I try to provide that psychoeducation early on so that parents also don't get too scared or activated if we come to a point where we need to do this again. So to just go over it briefly, the other thing I do with this screener is I don't ask the questions exactly as written because some of them are a little blunt. I'm trying to think of the right word. The first one I kind of ask as is like, okay, so we're going to talk about this thing that could be kind of hard. Are there ever times where you wish you could not wake up or wish that you could just sleep forever? I usually do kind of a soft startup like that. Not changing the question too much because this has been, you know, validated and tested. We don't want to go too far off what it's asking, but I try not to hit the kid with the first, like, do you want to be dead? And if they say yes to those other questions, okay, so you want to go to sleep, some days you don't want to wake up. Are there ever times you wish you could be dead or wished something could happen to you? Usually at that point, I would say most of my kids say yes. And so we move into the second piece, which is assessing for intent. They're looking to see where this kid's thoughts go. And so like I said, I don't love this language of like, have you actually had thoughts of killing yourself? But I'll try to ask something similar of like, okay, so you've had these thoughts about it would, it could. Do those thoughts ever turn into reality? Like, I really wish this would happen, or I would do this to make this happen. I start to get a little closer to the intent. And if the kid is comfortable, I'll get to the point of asking, okay, do you have thoughts about making a plan? Do you have thoughts about preparing to do something to kill yourself? And one of the best things I was taught in my training on suicidality was it's okay to say kill yourself. It's okay to say, are you thinking about being dead? It's much better. And from what we know, it's much more safe to use that language and keeps kids and adults safer rather than trying to talk around what the issue is. Because if they're dealing with it, they've already thought about it. You're not going to surprise them. You're not going to put something in their head that's not there. Like I said, most of my kids, unfortunately, have had these thoughts. And so we go into a little more into action and intent. So we've asked, do you have any thoughts? Do you have any intent? And then we get more into how do we keep you safe? So have you ever had any thoughts about what you would do, or have you ever started to do anything? Some kids are really shutting down here, and so you have to be a little more direct, even as you're being gentle. Other kids are pretty open to this and are able to tell you, I've thought about pills, I've thought about this. I haven't made a plan though, or I haven't really done anything, but I've thought about it. This is also where you'll hear protective things, like, I would never do that to my family. I would never, like, I wouldn't do it though because of my cats, my friends. You'll start to hear more protective language for kids who are safe. For kids who are in a crisis, they won't give you any of that. They won't tell you a reason why they wouldn't. They might not even really answer this question. That's usually when I push harder because that's usually an indication that we are in an emergency situation. Along with that, I kind of move into the next one. If I'm getting indications that they do have thoughts about what they would do, or they're telling me that they do have thoughts about what they would do, we move into the last piece, which is, okay, what have you done or what do you think about? Have you had these thoughts and started to do something with them? And this is kind of that last step before we're really talking about hospital. Does this kid have any protective factors in place? Do they say that their family is keeping them from hurting themselves? Do they have family at home all the time and no means? And so even though they're very distressed, they'll likely be okay. Many of my kids, this is kind of an orange. If you look at the color scaling, this is still kind of an orange section. This is usually where many of my kids who aren't in active crisis will say they have thoughts about means, but they can't for whatever reason. And this is where we start the safety plan. For kids who are in crisis and need to go to the hospital or we need a different level of care, we move into 5. Do you have a plan? Have you thought about what you would do? Have you thought about a date? Have you written letters? And that's where we start to move into safety planning. The last one is more of just an understanding of the risk factors. Have they ever done anything like this before? And I also adjust this question lightly, depending on the kid. Like, has this ever happened in the past? Was there ever a time you started to do something and maybe stopped, or that you thought about doing something or collected something and then didn't go through with it? And just trying to give them a like, let's talk about this. Let's make it as normal as we can, as calm as we can, but we have to talk about these things. So that's the Columbia screener. I use this all the time. I have a version in Spanish if I'm able to share it. Let me see if I can. Nope. Okay. Nancy, bear with me. I'm not sure if I can do this. I went too far with I shared one screen and then another, and I think I've reached the limit of my Zoom capability.
I wonder if you have a link, maybe we could post it on the chat.
Yes, I do have a link. I can send this to all of you too. I'm going to stop sharing for a minute and go back to my presentation because I don't know if I can get out of this one. Give me 1 second. Andale. Okay, I'm going to go back to sharing my presentation. ¿Dónde está? Ahí. But yes, I have links for all of these inside the presentation because I figured people might want them.
Great.
Now, okay, lovely. So I also have that in Spanish. Same thing in Spanish. I adjust the language so it's not as blunt. Sí, claro, Yareli. Sí lo comparto. So yeah, I think there's a line to walk, but I think luckily if people, I think everyone in the Consorcio has a background in mental health. I think we understand that balance of we can't go too far off the questions. And I definitely think, especially in working with Spanish-speaking families, especially in people who haven't really touched the mental health world before, it's okay to soften the language a little bit, give them a little more explanation, talk about why you're asking these questions so that you're not just hitting them over the head with these really uncomfortable, taboo conversations that can cause someone to shut down. How are we doing? I don't know. Before I jump into other kinds of crises other than suicidality, are there things that would feel helpful to talk more about with suicidality and assessing for suicidal ideation?
Shannon, I just want to recognize this is a really hard topic.
Yeah, it's heavy.
Yes, a heavy, coming on Tuesday morning, and you're doing a great job. So I think, yes, I think it's a great opportunity for people to kind of pause if they have some thoughts or questions. This is kind of my suggestion. If not, just continue, but that's kind of my suggestion.
I agree.
Excuse me, hi.
Hi, Dali.
Hi, nice to meet you, everyone.
Nice to meet you.
So is it possible to share this information with the school staff too, because we work with, dual language schools. We have a huge population with the Hispanic community, like Adams Immersion School, Wellston Elementary, Riverview. And I know, right now we are experiencing really hard um, issues in education too. So how we can collaborate with families and schools and with you, with organizations, because I think if we work together, I think we can offer better support for the whole community. So I am willing to share my school. I am at Wellstone Elementary. And yeah, I will be more than happy to help out with something, because it's huge. What is happening is huge in our community. Thank you.
Yeah, I think this is good information. Estoy pensando cómo sería más eficaz. Creo que compartir esta información con el personal de la escuela. Voy a buscar, no sé si hay un entrenamiento breve acerca de cómo, ¿cómo se dice eso, Nancy, Carolina? Like, to give the screener, or cómo, like, I'm blanking on the word in English and Spanish.
Hacer la evaluación, hacer la...
Yeah, ajá. Eso, como un entrenamiento breve para cómo hacer la evaluación, solamente para los que tal vez no tienen un like, clinical background, para que ellos puedan hacerlo de una forma todavía válida. Pero creo que sí, esta es empoderando de cierta forma. Es incómodo, pero como dije, la manera en que me he hecho muy cómodo en tener esta conversación es practicar una y otra vez. Entonces ahora, aunque no me gusta tener que tener esta conversación, no me siento incómoda, no me pongo muy ansiosa, porque he tenido esta conversación cientos de veces. Y creo que eso es algo que ayuda bastante.
Tenemos en el chat a Carolina dice, correct me if I'm wrong, but the SSRS needs to be completed by a mental health provider? Question mark.
Podría ser, de hecho no veo eso en el chat, no sé por
No,
qué.
yo se lo había mandado a Nancy.
Oh,
de hecho.
amén, sí.
That's okay.
Sí, podría ser que sí.
But I confused. I could be wrong,
Yeah.
But I understand that there are some training that you have to do, like a first aid, suicidal assessment, that you do, and it's basically, but I feel, again, I could be wrong, that this one had to be
Yo
completed.
creo que tal vez que
Makes
sí,
sense.
que tenga que estar completado por un profesional de la salud mental. Sin embargo, creo que hay un like mental health first aid
Per se.
entrenamiento,
Yeah.
que está disponible, que es gratuito, que está en the National Childhood Trauma Network and CTSN. I think they have a free training
And
for,
NAMI. NAMI
yeah,
too.
algo así.
And the thing is for liability. So it's basically just
Mhm.
making sure that, you're in a school, if you maybe let go the client or the child or the student, it could be liability issues, but don't take me like it's right. So
Ujú. Ya, creo que es asegurar que, por lo menos para esto, si uno tiene preocupaciones de que el niño sea en un estado de emergencia y que tal vez hará algo para tomar un paso para suicidio, o que está en ese estado mental, es estar confortable con estas preguntas y también llevarlo con la persona en la escuela o las personas que tienen su título o su licencia en la salud mental, para que ellos puedan confirmar. Lo segundo que voy a hacer en un momento es hablar de cómo tener esa segunda opinión o la primera opinión si uno es trabajador social en la escuela y no tiene licencia, o si es maestra o consejera. Voy a dar el recurso que yo uso para segunda opinión, para a veces not convince, but like support families en saber que hay dos personas que piensan que está en un estado grave. So comparto también esos recursos. Podría ser like the license, or the licensed person you need to complete this screen if you're not licensed or you're not coming from that background in your position. A ver qué dice el chat. Muy bien, gracias, Carolina. Save.org is another good resource.
they have a lot of trainings, a lot of information, because I think it's totally valid that I think what Dolly mentioned, like the schools had to deal with us. We have a lot of children in the school that experience suicidal ideation, and it's incredible the labor that school workers had to do. We have the resources to do it. So I really appreciate that Dolly mentioned that and bringing awareness about that. Just get the resources.
Yeah. Y creo que Dolly mencionó un punto increíblemente importante, que es no hay mucho entrenamiento. En muchos lugares donde deben de tener entrenamiento para cómo manejar situaciones así. Aún yo, trabajando en el campo de la salud mental, pasé un año trabajando para Washburn en el equipo de estabilización de crisis antes de tomar un entrenamiento con mis compañeras acerca de cómo manejar ideación de suicida. Lo otro que hice un link para ustedes. I added this podcast in Spanish that I use for many, many parents who are even a little bit open to having this conversation. It's a podcast by la doctora Marcela Castillo. Ella es una psicóloga en México. This specific episode, I think, does a very good job doing exactly this, talking calmly with parents about what to do if their child comes to them and says, this is a problem I'm having. I think I always tell parents there's a bit of a caveat, or there's a bit of a piece I don't necessarily agree with at the end, where she is a very strong believer in medication as an important or necessary step in treating suicidal ideation. I tell parents, that isn't necessarily my perspective, but it is the perspective of this doctor. I just want you to listen and take in the information about how to handle this as a parent. So I'd say that works about 50% of the time. It really depends on the parent or caregiver. It depends if they're open to this kind of information, if they're willing to listen. But I do really like this episode for a nice explainer of how to handle this as a parent, because you don't get the training as a parent either of how to assess or how to talk about scary situations like this. ¿Qué más? Son muy buenas preguntas y temas que ustedes ya tocaron. What else would be helpful about this? Like Carolina mentioned, it's heavy, and I think, yeah, it's just a tough topic that many, many of us are dealing with in the mental health field right now. Bueno, y si no hay algo más ahorita, por favor se sientan libres y bienvenidos de mandarme preguntas o conectar después y podemos hablar más. Y también mando toda esta información a Nancy y Carolina para que ellas puedan también compartir con ustedes. The other thing I will do then is also, voy a abrirlo en español. Ustedes pueden ver mi traducción muy mala of this rubric. A ver. ¿Se pueden ver eso? Debe de ver como un documento de Word. Okay, good. So, ese es un documento, or this is a document that we created in the crisis stabilization team to help our team respond to the crisis calls. And I think it's something that can be very helpful to share with parents or caregivers when a crisis is not happening. So I use this more as prevention and education. I'm trying to think if we should start from the beginning or not. I'll resumir. I'll summarize the first two, because I think this part is more of a skills part that is not as urgent in a crisis situation. But for example, we break up crises into 3 levels. So the green is basically the child will still engage with you. They'll still talk with you. They might be mad or depressed or desesperados, but they're like still talking back and forth. They're not screaming, they're not throwing, they're not trying to hurt themselves or anyone else. So I'll come back to that, but that's kind of our first level of this kid can still talk about what's happening to them. Usually where I'm entering with more parents and caregivers is this kind of blue moderate crisis. The child is very desesperado, very upset, having trouble controlling themselves, but not necessarily in danger. They don't have any dangerous objects on them. They may or may not be threatening to hurt themselves, but they're not doing anything about it in the moment. And so I'll come back to that one too. And then we have this last one, this one in yellow, kind of active crisis or true crisis. The child is threatening to hurt themselves, or they're threatening to hurt another person. They're talking about suicide. They're talking about, something that is going to cause significant damage to someone. So let me kind of go back to the top. I'll go through green and blue, maybe not in the full, like the full read through because it's a bit long. But what I will say about the green and the blue and the yellow is I walk parents through this as one of our parent sessions, just to give them some empowerment, some empoderamiento and language about how to handle a crisis, maybe in a different way than they have been. Many parents, because of their own trauma, because of their own stuff, when a crisis happens, they're going into crisis too. They're screaming, they're yelling, they're done, they're shutting down. And I try to use these skills or this information to help parents try something else, even if it's not their first reaction or their second reaction. So for a kind of crisis leve, or like a small crisis, like kid is upset but still talking, we talk about calming ourselves first. That's always the first step. Okay, tranquilícese a sí mismo. Dígase a sí mismo que puede enfrentar a la crisis con calma. Encourage yourself first before you even step in. Recuérdese, remember that kids need a calm adult in order to be calm. And so trying to focus, again, parents focusing on themselves. We talk a little bit about how to active listen and how to validate. Recognize the emotion. Sí, es que te sientes molesto, ¿cierto? O sí, estás enojado, sí, lo veo. And then, si el niño está dispuesto a hablar un poquito, ¿qué es que te hace sentir así? ¿Por qué estás tan enojado? So working with parents on skills to really just active listen and reflect emotion. Many parents struggle with this, or many caregivers struggle with this because of their own upbringing. And so even this skill, if we can work on it and get it a little more strong, it's huge movement in therapy. So I'm going to kind of go past the other part because it's a lot of the same, but a lot of validation, teaching that estoy aquí para ti, estoy para ayudarte, no me voy si no quieres que me vaya. Really just being present and offering that support and that co-regulation. I'm going to go ahead and move into the blue and yellow though, because that's more what we're talking about in this presentation. Kind of crisis moderada a crisis severa. Kind of a moderate crisis to a severe crisis. Your kid or this child is getting more and more upset. They might not have access to anything dangerous, but they're really not listening. They're throwing, they're yelling, they are face down, screaming into a pillow. They're not really engaging with you. And so we talk same thing with ourselves. Like I do this for myself when I'm on the phone and someone's screaming at me. I try to teach parents how to do this too. You have to try to calm yourself down a little bit. Even if it feels really impossible, you have to calm yourself first. I have to do this when I'm in crisis situations in the home. Try to breathe in, breathe out, loosen my muscles and try to be the only person there who is calm. So I work with parents and caregivers on the same thing. Notice your body, take a moment. It's better to take a moment rather than jump in feeling like you're already exploding. We talk a bit about evaluating for risk. So is there anything dangerous near you? Try to move it. So if there are knives, try to get out of the kitchen. If there's anything else that could be used for harm, try to block it or put it away. Get yourself out of the space where things could get worse. And then teaching parents phrases that they can use and repeat over and over again. Quiero apoyarte, pero ahorita tu cuerpo no está bien. If they're hitting or punching or kicking. Sigo aquí, from a safe distance. You don't want to get too close and get hit or do something that's going to make you feel even worse or even more angry and explosive. Cuando tu cuerpo esté bien o cuando tu cuerpo esté seguro, vamos a trabajar juntos para resolver esto. Still being a team. We're still together, but we're not going to hurt each other. I also talk to parents, and I think this is the part that maybe is not particularly culturally resonant for families. This is a question that maybe my colleagues ask more than I do, but does the parent feel safe? If they really don't feel safe, if they really feel like their child is going to hurt them, calling 911 for help and teaching parents how to say, mi niño está en una crisis de la salud mental, my child is in a mental health crisis, to at least try to limit or try to help if they are going to call 911 and get a police response, to try to mitigate what that response is going to be. So really teaching parents, like, if you feel you have to do this, we want to at least give them the information that this is a mental health crisis, so that as much as possible, we can try to avoid violence towards you or the child. We want to be really careful about this. And then a few other phrases for parents to work on, like, I feel like I'm not helping the situation. Siento que no estoy ayudando. Voy a quedarme aquí fuera de tu cuarto y cuando estés listo, aquí estoy para ti. And teaching parents to recognize what's going well in a crisis. So if the child is screaming or throwing and they stop that, but they're still doing a lot of other things that are not great, still saying, like, qué buen hecho que dejaste de hacer eso. Yo sé que es muy difícil, pero estamos progresando bien. Really giving them that encouragement and helping parents understand that encouraging in that moment is not encouraging the behavior forever. We can come back to those behaviors when everyone is calmer, but in that moment, we need to come down from being really, really activated, really, really mad or sad. Y lo último que tenemos para padres y cuidadores, or the last piece we have for caregivers and for ourselves in a crisis, is focusing on big crises. Parents are in danger, kid is in danger. What do we do? And so I really focus with parents on the same thing. Take a 1 second self-evaluation, breathe. Tell yourself you can handle this, even if you don't think you can. Notice your body. Start to give the child safe options. And we call it like the disco rayado, but the scratched record technique of just, puedes ir a tu cuarto o puedes quedarte aquí, no puedes salir de la casa. Y una y otra vez, puedes ir a tu cuarto para gritar, puedes quedarte acá en casa, pero no puedes salir de la puerta. Giving them ways to evaluate for security. So same thing, removing any dangerous objects, calling for help. We give a few different options for that. And emphasizing to parents the kind of priority of the behavior. So if the child is like contestando mal, if they're answering back in this whole crisis situation, not important right now. If they're trying to fight with you or argue with you or insult you, not important right now. We'll come back to it. But in that moment, estamos enfocándonos nomás en la crisis. We're focusing on the dangerous behavior, and we can come back around to insults or answering back. That'll be something we can talk more about when we're not in this crisis situation. And I think that's something that can be very difficult for parents who grew up in kind of this chaos and crisis to do. So that's a skill I focus on a lot. Same thing with the 911. I feel like that's a conversation we could have a whole presentation about, but kind of what to do if you feel as a parent that you are not safe anymore or your child is not safe and there's nothing you can do to help. That's at the point where we would call 911 or call a crisis line or both. And kind of what to tell your child if it gets to that point. So not doing it in secret. It's not a threat. It's not something that we're doing as punishment. It is, no tolero agresión en la casa, o la agresión física en la casa, o necesitamos ayuda. No podemos hacer eso juntos. Vamos a pedir ayuda. Really emphasizing we are calling for help together, because I can't keep you safe. We can't keep each other safe right now. Y abajo tenemos toda la información de los varios números de emergencia. We have all of the information about different county crisis lines, the hospitals that we generally refer to. So I would say this is not a great thing to use in an actual emergency. It is a really great thing to go over with yourself, with parents before an emergency. I feel like I pull this out pretty often. And even when I'm on the crisis line, anything all the way up to kind of that blue, I will use this as a way to remind myself of what it is we're doing, what it is we're checking for. So I'm going to quit sharing this again, but I do have this linked in English and in Spanish in the presentation. And it's informal. We just made this in our own program. So feel free, you can edit it on your own, save it on your own, and make it work better for what it is you do. Dejar de compartir y voy a volver to this. And I think ya son las 9:40, ¿verdad, Nancy? Tenemos nomás 20 minutos.
Sí, 9:40.
Okay. Uy, ok. Voy a tener que brincar un poquito, creo. Oh. No. Espérenme un tantito. Se pueden ver cuánto he usado el Zoom para presentar. Muy bien. Entonces sí voy a brincar un poquito, creo, porque... bueno, ok. Esta es la parte que mencioné que sí es importante. Para los que no tienen licencias... Oh, wait, veo un chat, disculpe. Yes, of course, Cassidy. I will share this presentation with Nancy and Carolina, or share it I can share it by email, I think, so that it doesn't get lost in the chat. And I made each one of these things a link, and so you should be able to just click on it and have a link open from the presentation. If that doesn't work, please reach out to me or to Nancy or Carolina, and I will make sure to get it to you. Because these are my go-to resources too. So I feel like they're good to have for everyone. So this other piece was just what I mentioned about if you don't have a license or if you just want backup. I've used this a couple times when I'm really not sure, like the kid could go either way and I kind of want a second opinion, or I feel like the parents might not be fully on board with me, not in agreement with me. And maybe we need a second opinion just to confirm what it is I'm thinking. So I'll just kind of give my personal experience with these. So COPE for Hennepin County, Minneapolis, I have really only had good experiences with. They occasionally have bilingual providers. I think it's really just luck, but they're very comfortable using interpreters. What I really like is that they can go to the home to do safety planning and de-escalation, which is huge and usually keeps kids out of the hospital. Because they're able to go, safety plan, stay for an hour or two, and close with parents and kid feeling a little more regulated than at the top of the crisis. I've had good experience as well with the Canvas mobile crisis response. I really have used them only through Anoka County, but they serve a bunch of counties. Same thing, 24/7 response. They go to the home or to where the crisis is happening and do the same thing, safety planning, de-escalation. The other crisis lines I use a lot are Ramsey and Dakota. I will say I've struggled a little more with both of those. I've had some really good experiences. I've had some really bad experiences. So it's been a little more of a mixed bag. I also don't know at this point in time, some of you might know a lot better than I do, if Ramsey and Dakota go to the home. That's not something I've experienced when I've called, but I also have more limited experience with them. But I would apply that across the board as well for those who aren't in the Twin Cities, who are in Wisconsin or elsewhere. If you don't have your own license or if you need backup, I absolutely use crisis lines as my second opinion. Like, okay, here's what I'm hearing from the kid, here's what I'm hearing from the parents, but let's have you come in too and just kind of confirm for us, especially when caregivers are on the fence and not feeling so sure about what's happening. I use it as one more person to be those eyes, because maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I forgot to ask something. Maybe I'm jumping the gun. Maybe, I'm reacting too strongly. Maybe we actually can keep things safe at home. And that's why I will ask another provider to come in and essentially do the same risk assessment. Bueno, déjenme revisar rapidito. ¿Qué piensan ustedes? Podemos hablar un poquito acerca de planes de seguridad. We can talk a little bit about safety plans. I can talk about the washroom one, or we could take the last 20 minutes or so to talk about cultural identity and safety planning, as well as what does and doesn't work culturally within safety planning. What would feel most helpful?
I would agree. Sí, parece que tenemos en el chat Cultural Identity and Safety.
Me encanta. Qué bueno que puedes ver porque creo que ya se me bloqueó y no puedo ver el chat.
Okay.
So cultural identity and safety planning. Excellent. Good. So this is a piece I think I find very interesting. And like I said, in some ways, I find that within the Spanish-speaking community, there are more protective factors than there are maybe in some English-speaking communities. So a couple of things about safety planning. You're essentially looking for, and I can just resume, I can summarize the last slide. You're looking for tools they can use, so actions, activities, people, so tools that a child or adult can use to stay safe or ride out the emotion that's happening. You're looking for a support system, so which people are going to be their people, families, friends, padrinos, compadres, church, school, like where are their people? And then the last piece is, who do we call if no one that is in our group, no one that's in our support system is available? Who do we go to? So that's essentially safety planning in a nutshell. I think with cultural identity and safety planning, this could also be a whole presentation. I also feel like, so I'm a white provider coming into these spaces, I feel like maybe I'm not the best person to speak into how cultural identity plays into safety planning. But what I did for this group is I listed just a few, I think, culturally common aspects with Spanish-speaking families that seem to make safety planning more effective. And I think it's something we can also discuss briefly as a group. So one thing I find much more effective whenever possible is involving family. Like I do not do safety plans or risk assessment in isolation unless there is some sort of risk to the child. So I try to involve parents, caregivers, extended family, maybe not right at the moment where we're risk assessing or right at the moment where we're doing a safety plan, but after. I'll go and talk to the family, I'll go and talk to the parent. I try and make it very conversational. I try and leave a lot of space for parents and caregivers to ask questions, to even let out their emotions on me. Maybe they're mad or upset. I want that to hit me if we can, and not the child. And I really, it's not always something that's within our control, but I try to take extra time to support caregivers in feeling as comfortable as they possibly can with really uncomfortable and taboo topics. Both things, I think suicidality more so, but your child being a threat to you or your child being a threat to others is also very taboo and uncomfortable. I try to decrease as much shame as I can in those conversations. And the primary thing I'm doing with support people, so parents, caregivers, is helping them think through, who are your supports? Who are your friends? Is there anyone you would be okay telling about this? One friend, one sister, one someone. Who's your person? A priest, like anyone. So that they're not alone in feeling like this is they're carrying this weight and no one else knows about it. Another thing I do to try to make safety planning more culturally available, more culturally aligned with the caregivers I'm working with is providing a psychoeducation about what I know to be true. The fact that asking directly, we know right now, at least, we think we know that is the safest way to talk to kids and people about whether they're at risk. I try to work with them on tools, things that feel comfortable. How can we talk about risk with your kid? Can we use colors? Can we use like a volcano? Can we picture, an iceberg? Images, colors, numbers, whatever the family is most comfortable with or feels like clicks with them, that's what I want to use. Sometimes we talk about too what the risks and benefits are of calling the hospital or especially calling the police. I think that's a conversation that my colleagues maybe don't have to have. And That's something I spend a lot of time on with caregivers is what does and doesn't happen if you call the police, and the benefits or the disadvantages of calling the crisis line versus the police, depending on the situation. So basically, I'm trying to build caregivers up as much as possible. There's a lot of role reversal in the families I work with because of language barriers and being immigrants in a country that's not friendly or familiar to you. And so as much as I can, I try to help parents return to that role of parent. Like you get to be in control of some things, you get to know some things and make the decisions. The last couple are kind of being creative, like really same thing, creatively exploring the support system. Who is there? Do we have spirituality? Like, is this a family that's spiritual or religious? Is that an outlet? Are there creative outlets, art, dance, activities that you do as a family that would feel helpful in moments like these? Mindfulness practices of any kind, prayer, actual mindfulness, like from YouTube, other meditations that maybe the family does, saying the rosary, like whatever feels grounding to that family. And the last couple are assessing for preference. I try to check language preference for a client. Just as kind of an example, some of my clients really find, because they grow up bilingual, most of the time they find practices in Spanish like maybe more helpful, maybe it's more calming. Other clients, because of their relationship with their parents or caregivers, find Spanish really triggering and not helpful and activating. So assessing with the client, what feels good when you're in a really bad spot? And that last piece is similar for caregivers, but I'm assessing more language and media preference. Like I have a number of parents for whom Spanish is their second language or third language. And so trying to check for like what feels helpful. Is Spanish language written material even something that works for you, or is that not comfortable? Would you prefer maybe images or audio? Like what works? And giving them safety plans and resources in whatever way works for them. And sometimes that will mean like putting the number into their phone and putting some like emojis in it, just to give them something where like, this one is the one I call. This is what I do when I need to get help. So yeah, that's some of the things I could think of that I've done to adapt a bit with safety planning. But like I said, I think this could be a whole conversation. Y tal vez queremos tomar los últimos 5 minutos, 10 minutos, Nancy, se hablarlo un poco más, no sé.
Ya. Y si alguien en particular también tiene ideas o pensamientos sobre la conversación, quizás pueden también compartir lo que ustedes han notado y en su práctica de ustedes. O si tienen alguna pregunta también.
Pues yo quiero agradecerles por este espacio y también me gustaría de pronto si pudiéramos ampliar la información para que llegue más a la comunidad, no sé, de otra manera, para invitar más personas, porque sí es importante lo que compartieron hoy. Entonces, gracias y nada, espero seguir compartiendo con ustedes y aprendiendo mucho. Gracias.
Sí, eso me parece tan importante también. Yo antes era terapeuta de escuelas o school-based therapist, y una pregunta que se me ocurrió es, ¿podrían los mobile crisis? No estoy segura, pero quizás ir a la escuela. Eh, Solo, bueno, y la pregunta es porque a veces yo sé que los trabajadores sociales están a veces en una crisis y a veces no hay un personal quizás que tenga el entrenamiento para lidiar con varias crisis, o si no está, o si está en vacaciones, cualquier cosa, pero quizás recurrir la comunidad y a esos recursos puede ser una idea para apoyar, I guess, el trabajo en las escuelas.
Yeah. Yo creo que sí. Nunca he preguntado esa pregunta específicamente a ellos, pero que yo sepa, es un recurso para cualquier persona que cree que está en un estado de crisis. I think it's a resource that can be used in schools. At the very least, they'll tell you if they feel like it's something that could be managed without their physical support at school. But it certainly would be someone else to do that evaluation and to sit with you and to talk the kid through what's going on. And I don't see any reason why they couldn't come to a school, especially if someone was on vacation or there wasn't anyone else there. I think that would be, from what I remember of the last time I had to make a call like this, one of the things they're going to check is what safe adults are around. And so they may feel that if the school social worker or therapist can get to the child within a reasonable amount of time, that would be an okay safety plan. But they may also feel if you say no, that the therapist is busy for the next who knows how long hours, we don't have anyone else. I believe they may be able to, but it's a good question. It would be good to confirm. I know they would for sure be available for the evaluation piece over the phone.
Pues muchas gracias, Shannon, por compartir tu tiempo con nosotros hoy día.
Claro.
He visto aquí muchas gracias. Thank you so much. Puse en el chat también, entonces vamos a concluir el training de hoy, pero vamos a decir si alguien quisiera o tuviera una pregunta, podrían ellos mandarte un correo electrónico, quizás
Claro.
a
Déjame
mí,
poner.
si podemos proveer la
Ujú.
información.
Primero pongo mi correo de Washburn, nomás para que puedan mandar. Shannon, Quinn, pero sí, también comparto la presentación en sí para que puedan revisar todo y hay links ahí, hay más información que no pude tocar hoy, entonces.
Ok, muy bien. Entonces, gracias a todos por estar hoy día con nosotros. Nuestra próxima reunión vamos a hacer como un clinical consultation, pero comunitario. Entonces, vamos a presentar sobre un caso que tenga temas de la comunidad latina y vamos a consultar sobre ello para ver qué intervenciones estamos usando en nuestra comunidad y así también poder aprender de uno a otro sobre cómo tener intervenciones con nuestros clientes o con la comunidad latina. Y eso va a ser el 16 de febrero, también 8:30 a 10 de la mañana. La próxima reunión es el viernes, entonces el viernes 16 de febrero. Pero por ahorita, muchas gracias a todos. Nos vemos para la próxima.
Gracias, Nancy.
Hasta luego.
Muchas gracias. Hasta luego. Adiós.